من جمعونا بالليلة نفسها بالليل نريد نتحرك بها الكويت جمعونا الساعة 4 العصر.
We gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion.
أسماء مناطق الكويت على المنضدة وبعدين هم كانوا.
On a map table we were shown our objectives in Kuwait.
بعدين من
Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We'd been asked to help set up the new government.
الحكومة الكويتية راح تتغير وطالبين نعاون الحكومة الكويتية لترتيب الحكومة الجديدة.
Now in exile, at that time General Wafiq al-Samurai met Saddam almost daily. He remembers Saddam double-checking his calculations.
كان يعتقد بأن ردود
Saddam thought any reprisals would be limited and would tail off with time.
تخف تدريجيا. كان يعتقد بأن
He believed that America's involvement in Vietnam had destroyed its willingness to use military power. Vietnam had been an outright defeat.
كانت هزيمة لأمريكا هزيمة سياسية وعسكرية.
As they spoke, a satellite took this photograph. American intelligence analysts searched for the bases which had been crammed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks. But when they found them, the bases were empty. Tank tracks led towards Kuwait. The Pentagon went to its highest alert level.
We issued WatchCon 1. It was the first time the DIA, since the system was established, had gone to WatchCon 1 because we wanted to make it very clear that this was a different condition. The buildup was complete. We would receive no more warning, but the invasion was imminent.
More photographs arrived. This time they showed assault helicopters at Iraqi airfields within striking range of Kuwait. The US Defense Secretary met with his generals.
I explained to them that I was quite sure that this was a plan. I couldn't guarantee them that they were going to invade, but I felt that all the indications were there that they were going to invade.
As I walked out of that meeting with Secretary Cheney, I said, Dick, this cannot be just a feint, and we've got to try to get some kind of message off immediately.
I was essentially deputized to go back to the White House to meet with Scowcroft and the president and to convince them to take one last shot at trying to influence Saddam. And just as we were talking about what exactly he would say to Saddam in this last effort to get him to think twice before doing anything, that's when the phone rang saying, "We just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started, this war, whatever it is, has begun."
Well, on that morning, I was woken up by a large explosion, and I looked out the window, and there's the tower, all in a pall of smoke. I thought, hello, we got a problem going on here.
Republican Guard tanks started to seal off the city. Special forces were landed by helicopter on the beaches. They advanced to seize key government buildings. The emir had stood down his army to avoid provoking Saddam. Many Kuwaiti officers were abroad on their summer holidays, and the Iraqis had laid their plans with care.
We reached the National Assembly and found the gate locked and unguarded. We'd been briefed about the guards' routine. We had exact information that they didn't arrive to collect their weapons until 6 a.m., so we went in before that. We were expecting to find some soldiers, but they were probably asleep because no one fired at us.
With binoculars, we could see the helicopters flying around like hornets, and you could see the smoke coming off the missiles that they were firing.
I received a call from a friend in the foreign ministry, and he told me that the foreign minister said that now, and stress now, is the time for the U.S. to act. And I said to him, there may have been a time to act yesterday, there may be a time to act in the future, but I don't know what we can do right now.
A few Kuwaiti units mounted a hasty defense of the emir and his palace, but Iraqi tanks soon overwhelmed them. The emir was driven away with minutes to spare. The emir and his bodyguard made for Saudi Arabia, mingling with confused rush-hour traffic. Iraqi intelligence had expected the emir's capture and already anticipated how he would be dealt with.
القسم الآخر من السموم هو الثاليوم.
Thallium is a poison that has a very strong impact on the nervous system. It leads to death within 1 month of administration.
ممكن أن يودي بمن يتناوله خلال.
It's what has happened many times to opposition figures.
وحصلت هكذا حالات كثيرة تجاه المعارضة.
By noon, Saddam Hussein controlled 1/5 of the world's oil.
For us, it was shocking. Shocking. I couldn't believe that this could happen in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein, we were very in good terms, and he was a friend. We know each other very well, but didn't expect him to do that.
Saddam probably figured the Arab world and the world at large would bitch and moan for a couple of days, and then people would get used to it. And the world would essentially learn to live with it. And the United States, which had left Lebanon a decade before and so forth, was not going to do anything. And even if the United States wanted to do something, the local Arabs would never do anything. They would never work with the United States and stand up to Saddam. So I think Saddam took the pretty intelligent decision that he could probably get away with it.
President, yeah, Helen.
Do you contemplate intervention as one of your options?
We're not discussing intervention. I would not discuss any military options.
The president summoned his National Security Council to decide what to do.
This meeting.
But George Bush's confused statement to the press set the tone for the subsequent meeting.
General Scowcroft and I were on the phone.
It was rambling and inconclusive.
We really needed some time to come to grips with this basic fundamental question of our strategic assessment of what this meant. Did it matter that he'd taken Kuwait?
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen, Colorado. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about it, about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
But now Saddam Hussein had his first stroke of bad luck. Another leader was also in Aspen.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out. And really, by that time in my mind, I thought we ought to throw him out so decisively that he could never think of doing it again.
It was like two soulmates finding each other. They found from the very first words that they were exactly on the same wavelength, that this was a tremendously serious event, that it could not be tolerated, and something had to be done.
The president said little to the press, but he was already inclining towards action. Margaret Thatcher remembers telling him Saddam Hussein was a potential Hitler who had to be stopped. It was talk that steeled the president's determination.
Don't forget, George Bush fought bravely in the last war. He knew what it was like to fight. He was injured. So he knew that if you didn't turn out an aggressor, then you could have simply terrible consequences for future generations.
The president returned to Washington. He led a country for whom the last war was not the war with Hitler, but the quagmire of Vietnam. Nevertheless, at the White House and later at Camp David, the president and his advisors now met to take the first steps towards war. The CIA director began with an electrifying warning.
Over 100,000 Iraqi troops had found their way south of Kuwait City, indicating yet another intention beyond the invasion of Kuwait either to terrorize Saudi Arabia or to actually invade it.
One of the first questions was, is he going to stop at the borders of Kuwait? Saddam, is he going to stop there? Or is he likely to go on into Saudi Arabia and move down to the oil fields?
The key decision that came out of that meeting is, we will defend Saudi Arabia. There was no debate about that. The question I then posed is, then what? Are we prepared, should we be prepared to go forward and fight for Kuwait?
The president made no response. Vietnam had shaped Colin Powell. Powell feared the military was again in danger of being trapped in an unpopular war in a faraway place.
For those of us who were Vietnam veterans, we all have a view that says, if you're going to put us into something, then you owe the armed forces, you owe the American people a clear statement of what political objective you're trying to achieve.
Initially, anyway, General Powell was not as concerned about the crisis as I was. He, in fact, was more of an advocate of sanctions as opposed to military force. The senior military leadership understands better than anybody else that if, in fact, you're going to use military force, you're going to suffer casualties. It's almost impossible not to. And it's their people that are hurt in the process.
I don't recall walking out of that meeting with a decision that the armed forces of the United States now have the mission to prepare to attack into Kuwait to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
While Colin Powell left for Washington to organize troops to defend Saudi Arabia, Brent Scowcroft stayed at Camp David with the president to persuade the Saudis to accept the troops. The next afternoon, the president returned to the White House.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
On live television, the generals watched the president commit the United States to liberating Kuwait.
I've got to go. I have to go to work. I got to go to work.
I liked it. I liked it very much. Others, Colin Powell says, that'll teach us to leave you up at Camp David alone with him.
Satellites now showed 2 Iraqi divisions on the Saudi border. The CIA reported the Saudis were considering buying Saddam off. If the Iraqis attacked Saudi Arabia's ports, Saddam would control yet another fifth of the world's oil.
I asked the Saudi ambassador to come in, and he said that the Saudis weren't at all sure they wanted to be helped by the United States. And he cited a couple of examples where the United States had offered help and then demonstrated enormous weakness. And he said, frankly, we're afraid you say you'll help and then the going will get tough and you'll pull out and we'll be left.
The president dispatched his defense secretary to Saudi Arabia. Dick Cheney and his high-level delegation had to convince Saudi Arabia's rulers it might soon be another Kuwait. They met with the king.
I told King Fahd that they did not have the luxury of waiting until Saddam began an invasion of Saudi Arabia and then asked for our help, because then it would be too late.
When Norm Schwarzkopf started laying out what we were prepared to send to Saudi Arabia, beginning with 200,000 troops, I just had the sense that Fahd was absolutely stunned.
At the end of that discussion, the king turned and said, "Okay." And I almost fell out of my chair because I absolutely was sitting there thinking, well, you know, this is going to be, thank you very much for the information, we'll let you know. And the king said, okay. And I think we all did a double take and went back and said, you know, Secretary Cheney said, "So you agree?" And the king said, "Yes, I agree." We walked out of the meeting and I said to Secretary Cheney, I said, "Sir, I'm prepared to start the flow now. Do you want me to do that?" And Secretary Cheney said, "Yes." And so I turned to Chuck and I said, "Chuck, send them on their way."